What's up guys, Charlie from Airplane Academy. Today the weather sucks, frankly, so we're filming a video inside and we're going to be covering 5 really practical tips that I hope will help you become a more proficient and definitely a more confident instrument pilot. These are 5 of my favorite tips that have ever been given to me. 5 in particular is my favorite one, that 5th one. So let's dive right in. Tip number 1 is to be ahead of the airplane at all times. So much of instrument flying is about task saturation and cockpit management. There can be a lot of things going on, particularly when you can't see outside the airplane. It's so procedurally based that it's easy to get overwhelmed. And one of the easiest ways to combat this is to simply be ahead of the airplane. That means in your head, be expecting what is going to be the next phase of flight. What do I need to be doing to prepare for that, etc. You just really need to be several steps ahead of the airplane. Particularly the bigger airplanes you fly, the more you need to be ahead of it because things happen fast. One of the areas that this really helped me in training was I used to really struggle with getting cleared for approaches. For some reason, that was something that always threw me for a loop because it seemed like the air traffic control transmissions were really easy until they cleared me for an ILS. And usually what they would look like coming back into Addison Airport where I was training is that they were going to give you an intercept angle and an altitude to hold, and they're going to tell you where you were from the fix and all this information and clear you for approach. And for some reason that felt really, really overwhelming to me because it felt like 3 paragraphs of information. You'd just be going along and they'd say, hey, 916 Delta Foxtrot, you're 3 miles from Jarrett, maintain 300 and 2100 till establish your cleared ILS 33 approach. Like, whoa, hello, we got to slow down a little bit. But as I started to try to be ahead of the aircraft, every time I was coming back into land after a lesson, I knew we were going to, fly some approach. And if we're flying the ILS, they're probably going to give me some sort of intercept. And I knew this was coming. And so as I started just to be a little bit more ahead of the airplane, and if I knew we were getting vectors to final on our approach, then they were going to give me an intercept and a clearance, right? So suddenly I started expecting an intercept angle and an altitude and a clearance and instructions, right? And so when you start to hear that, you're not as rattled by it when you're expecting it. So again, just really try to be thinking ahead of the airplane in all phases of flight, particularly when it comes to air traffic control. That's going to help you be a lot more confident, but just try to really be ahead of the airplane. Tip number 2 is to train at night. And this is as much a practicality as it is a safety measure. So when I got my instrument rating, I did pretty much all of it, like 90+% at night. And this was just purely out of function for me because I had a daytime job. I'd work all day and then I was able to train at night and go do instrument flying because there's no regulation about nighttime versus daytime operations. Whereas when you're getting your private and your commercial, it's pretty much has to be done all during the day because there's visual maneuvers, et cetera, et cetera. But for IFR, you can do it all at night if you want. You can do it in the middle of the night if you want. And when the weather is bad, all the better because you get to go do actual IFR. So if you're struggling to figure out how you're going to have the hours to do your instrument rating, think about doing it at night. If you're in a situation that allows for that, that was a super useful tool for me that I could just go there after work and work on my training. But also from a safety perspective, if you can get some night training either while you're getting your instrument rating or then after you've been rated, or if you're flying with a safety pilot, I think flying at night IFR is super helpful because while it technically isn't any different than flying during the day because you can't see outside, right? I think there's a mental shift where you start to add up all these factors, not necessarily risk factors, but just elements of the flight that might get in your head as a pilot. And it's just another factor, right? So daytime flying versus nighttime flying, it's not very much harder, but it's just different, right? So if you're not used to flying at night and then you find yourself in an IFR situation and the sun goes down and now it's night IFR and you've never flown night IFR, you really want to be able to have some reps flying at night. Honestly, I think it's easier because the cockpit is pretty dark and you can just focus on the instruments, and I really, really enjoyed it. Maybe that's because at the time that's all I ever knew because I was doing it all at night, but I found it really enjoyable. But it's a practical measure and it's also a big time safety measure. So fly at night if you can. Tip number 3 is to try to figure out some pitch and power settings of your aircraft. Again, IFR is so much about task saturation and a lot of moving pieces in the cockpit. So we want to try to do everything at our disposal to reduce the amount of things that our brain is processing. And one of the times that it's going to be the most task saturated is going to be while you're flying the final approach. Because you're changing altitude, you're trying to maintain your airspeed, you're looking to see if you come out of IMC, you're thinking about the missed approach procedure, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that is when all the action's happening. And so a kind of a hack that I've found has really been to memorize some power settings to get your desired descent rate. So for me in my 182, and it's going to be different for everybody, I fly about 14 inches of manifold pressure on the final approach, and that gives me about 90 knots and 400 to 500 feet per minute descent with 10 degrees of flaps. So it's one less thing I have to think about. That, I mean, I'm still gonna have to manage airspeed, make small adjustments, but in general, that's my target. So I'm not having to really think too much about I'm approaching the final approach fix. Okay, now what am I gonna do? What's that transition gonna be? I mean, you kind of turn it into a procedure, and you can even write it down if you want, to where you know, okay, this is what I'm going to do. This is going to give me my desired descent rate, etc. So in a Cessna, I've heard about 2100, Cessna 172, 2100 RPMs could be a good setting. Again, for me in the 182, it's 14 inches manifold pressure. It's different for everybody. So try to find some sort of pitch and power setting and at least get a starting point, and then you can refine it. Next time you're flying an approach, figure out, was it 14 inches? Was it 2100 RPMs? What was it? And then give yourself a starting point. So instead of having to make big swings in the amount of power you're using to find that airspeed and that descent rate, you can at least have a starting point, and then you're only changing it maybe a couple inches of manifold pressure, maybe a few hundred RPMs. You're not doing these wild swings. So that's going to be a really helpful shortcut if you can hone that in for your aircraft. Tip number 4 is that you can disagree with air traffic control. Now, depending on your background, before you got into instrument flying, you might have been doing a lot of flying that involved air traffic control, or this might be a brand new thing to you. But either way, I think as instrument pilots, sometimes we can get in the habit of just obeying whatever air traffic control says to us, because they're giving us vectors and they're giving us a lot of instructions, and there's just a lot of back and forth there, whereas it wasn't as ATC heavy in our VFR days, right? And so it can be easy to just get in the habit of assuming that they're correct, and you don't want to speak up if you see something wrong. But I think it's really, really good to build the habit of inventorying what they're telling you, and make sure that that goes in line with the safety of the flight. If they're giving you something that feels wrong, or they're turning you, the wrong way into inbound traffic, or they're giving you a vector into a storm cloud that, you can see but they can't, you really have to speak up, because they're humans, they make mistakes also. Even just a couple weeks ago, I was getting a really weird vector onto an approach, and I spoke up, and he said, "Hey, I thought you were flying a different approach." I said, "Hey, check the tape." I requested a different approach, so we weren't on the same page. But it was good for me to speak up and say, "Hey, you're giving me kind of a weird vector here, or you're clearing me to do a fix that's not even on my approach." You need to be able to speak up. Don't just kind of go along with it. Those guys are really, really good, but even though they will tell you that they make mistakes, and we're all just trying to have a safe flight. So make sure that you are thinking about what air traffic control is telling you and deciding if that is in the best interest for the safety of the flight. If something doesn't feel right, speak up. It's okay to disagree with air traffic control. And so tip number 5 has to do with copying down IFR clearances. Now, I actually put a whole separate video on this tip and how to implement it, and I'm going to link it right up here in the corner. But the short version is that IFR clearances can sometimes be intimidating to copy down, because controllers sometimes are just trying to see how fast they can possibly read. It's just kind of how it goes. And if you don't know what to expect, it can be really terrifying to write down a bunch of gibberish. So the short version is that you can learn what to expect, so you're not having to write everything down as fast as they're talking. And then you can also come up with shorthand for yourself, so that you're not having to write verbatim what they're saying and write full words. You can come up with some of your own short codes where you can copy down full-length words or phrases or instructions, trimmed down to sometimes single letters or just symbols or things like that. So go watch that video. I think it's going to help. I mean, gosh, once I kind of learned to implement that, copying IFR clearances got super easy, and I wasn't ever scared of it ever again. But the first time you're starting to learn how to do that, it can be pretty scary. So those are my favorite tips that I've gotten as an IFR pilot. There's a ton more. We've got an article linked down in the description, where I actually list my favorite 16, but out of those 16, these were my favorite 5. So I hope they helped. If you've got another thing that really helped you as an instrument pilot and something that you would love to share, then I'd love to see you in the comments and hear about it then. So this weekend, hopefully we're going to fly and get to go film it as the weather gets better. But until then, I hope you guys will hit subscribe so you don't miss any future content we're coming out with. So till then, see you guys in the next video.